Metaphysical Poets. The term metaphysical poets was coined by Samuel Johnson to describe a diverse group of 17th century English poets. Their poetry was characterized by inventive conceits and a focus on spoken rather than lyrical qualities. These poets were not formally connected, and their recognition came much later in the 20th century. The foremost metaphysical poet was John Donne, known for his intellectual complexity and concentrated style. Other notable metaphysical poets include Henry Vaughan, Andrew Marvell, John Cleveland, Abraham Cowley, George Herbert, and Richard Crashaw. While they lacked a cohesive movement, their distinct styles contributed to the era's literary landscape. The metaphysical poets employed a unique style characterized by the fusion of emotion and intellectual ingenuity. Their work was marked by wit, where seemingly unrelated ideas and concepts were forcibly combined to provoke thought in readers. Their poetry delved into the exploration of feelings rather than mere expression, delving into the depths of the poet's consciousness. These poets used bold literary devices, including obliquity, irony, and paradox. Their direct language and rhythms, borrowed from everyday speech, added to the dramatic impact of their work. While their poetry lacked a formal movement, the metaphysical style influenced later poets, both within and beyond their era, adapting to various contexts. Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan was a Welsh metaphysical poet, author, and translator who wrote in English and practiced as a medical physician. His significant contributions to religious poetry are evident in his work Silix Scintillans, published in 1650, with the second part following in 1655. In 1646, he released Poems with the 10th satire of juvenile Englishhead. Inspired by the religious poet George Herbert, Vaughan decided to forsake idle verse. His prose works, Mount of Olives and Solitary Devotions, reflect his profound convictions and genuine spirituality. Vaughan also ventured into translating short moral and religious works, in addition to composing two medical prose works. During the 1650s, he embarked on a medical practice that lasted throughout his life. In his poetic career, Vaughan displayed originality, even though he borrowed phrases from fellow writers like George Herbert and sometimes employed similar titles for his poems. His unique gift lay in spiritual vision and imagination, enabling him to craft fresh and compelling verses. Notably, his poem The World opens with the memorable lines, "I saw eternity the other night, like a great ring of pure and endless light." Vaughan was equally adept at portraying nature, maintaining the belief that every living thing, even inanimate objects, shares a connection with the anticipation of resurrection. His influence can be discerned in the works of later poets, such as the Romantic poet William Wordsworth. During his lifetime, and for about a century after his death, Vaughan's poetry went largely unnoticed. However, in the 20th century, there was a resurgence of interest in the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, including Henry Vaughan. The standard edition of his works is Works, published 1914, with a second edition published in 1957, edited by L.C. Martin. John Cleveland. John Cleveland was a prominent English poet of his era, widely recognized as the most popular poet of his time. Although he later faced considerable criticism, he remained one of the most frequently cited metaphysical poets. During his poetic career, Cleveland gained fame for his satirical work, The Rebel Scot, which lambasted his enemies during the period when Charles I was handed over to parliamentary forces by the Scots army. Even when imprisoned for delinquency in 1655, Cleveland did not waver in his royalist convictions, maintaining his loyalty to the crown. Cleveland's poems initially made their appearance in The Character of a London Diurnal, published in 1647, and continued to be published in numerous collections over the next quarter century. The multitude of editions during his time highlights his immense popularity in the mid-17th century. Although Cleveland is often criticized for his excessive use of metaphysical obscurity and conceits, his poems are sometimes regarded as intellectual exercises rather than integral expressions of thought. Despite facing criticism, Cleveland's significant contribution lies in his political poems, primarily composed in heroic couplets, which satirized contemporary individuals and issues. His political satires had a lasting impact on his friend Samuel Butler, who later penned Hudibras. Additionally, Cleveland's use of heroic couplets foreshadowed the style adopted by John Dryden in his works. Abraham Cowley. Abraham Cowley was an English poet and essayist known for his fanciful and decorous poetry. He made notable contributions to English literature, particularly in adapting the Pindaric Ode to the English verse. During his poetic career, Cowley displayed a penchant for elaborate and self-consciously poetic language that often adorned rather than conveyed his emotions. In his youth, he composed verses such as Poetical Blossoms in various editions, which emulated the intricate rhyme schemes of Edmund Spenser. In The Mistress, published 1647, Cowley ventured into the realm of metaphysical wit, a style famously associated with John Donne. However, his extravagant poetic conceits and fanciful language in this work sometimes veered into what later critics considered poetic nonsense. One of Cowley's significant contributions was his attempt to reproduce the enthusiastic manner of the ancient Greek poet Pindar in his Pindaric Odes. These odes employed lines of uneven length and further exaggerated poetic conceits to capture Pindar's style. Cowley also embarked on writing an unfinished epic titled Davideis. In the realm of drama, his stage comedy, The Guardian, introduced the character Puny, a fop who later became a fixture in Restoration comedy. Beyond his literary endeavors, Cowley was involved in the promotion of the Royal Society and authored a proposition for the advancement of experimental philosophy. During his retirement, he wrote contemplative essays reminiscent of Michel de Montaigne. Cowley is often regarded as a transitional figure between the metaphysical poets and the Augustan poets of the 18th century. While he enjoyed widespread admiration during his lifetime, his influence waned over time. Alexander Pope's question in 1737, "Who now reads Cowley?" reflected the diminishing relevance of his work. Nonetheless, his elegy on the death of his friend Richard Crashaw remains one of his most poignant and effective poems. George Herbert. George Herbert was a distinguished Welsh poet, orator, and priest within the Church of England. Revered as one of the foremost British devotional lyricists, his poetry is intimately linked with the metaphysical poets' tradition. Born into a prosperous and artistic family, he spent his formative years in England and received a well-rounded education that paved the way for his admission to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1609. His original intention was to embark on a religious vocation as a priest, but his academic journey led him to become the university's public orator, garnering recognition from King James I. George Herbert also ventured into politics, serving in the Parliament of England in 1624 and briefly in 1625. Throughout his life, George Herbert engaged in poetic endeavors, and it was from his deathbed that he entrusted a manuscript volume of his poems to Nicholas Ferrer, with the request to decide whether to publish or destroy them. In 1633, Ferrer chose to publish these works under the title The Temple, Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations. George Herbert viewed his poems as a reflection of the profound spiritual struggles he underwent on his journey towards complete submission to the will of Jesus, his master, a transformation he ultimately achieved, embracing perfect freedom. Herbert's poetic style draws parallels with John Donne, an archetypal metaphysical poet and a close family friend. The Temple encompasses various themes including personal reflections, doctrinal musings, and considerations of church rituals. One notable characteristic of Herbert's poems is their resemblance to everyday language, infused with rhythms of speech. Some of his poems, such as The Altar and Easter Wings, take on unique forms known as pattern poems, where the lines visually conform to the subject matter. Although this practice was later criticized as false wit by Joseph Addison in the 18th century, it remains a distinctive feature of Herbert's work. In the 19th century, Samuel Taylor Coleridge praised Herbert's diction as pure, manly, and unaffected. George Herbert demonstrated mastery not only in metrical form but also in various aspects of the craft of verse. Despite sharing the critical disapproval directed at metaphysical poets until the 20th century, he continued to resonate with readers. In addition to his poetry, Herbert authored A Priest to the Temple or The Country Parson, His Character and Rule of Life in 1615 too, offering insights into his spiritual and religious perspectives. The standard edition of his works is Herbert's Works, edited by F. Hutchinson. Richard Crashaw. Richard Crashaw was a notable English poet, teacher, High Church Anglican cleric, and later a Roman Catholic convert. He is celebrated as one of the prominent metaphysical poets in the 17th century English literary landscape. Crashaw hailed from a family with Anglican and Puritan background, with his father gaining fame as a staunch pamphleteer and polemicist against Catholicism. His educational journey took him through Charterhouse School and Pembroke College, Cambridge. Following his degree, Crashaw became a fellow at Peterhouse, Cambridge, where he embarked on publishing religious poetry characterized by its mystical nature and unwavering Christian faith. The tumultuous period of the English Civil Wars saw Crashaw's position at Peterhouse become untenable due to his growing inclination toward Roman Catholicism. He resigned from his post to avoid eviction by the Puritans. In 1646, he prepared the first edition of his collection, Steps to the Temple, Sacred Poems with Other Delights of the Muses. This compilation featured both religious and secular poems in Latin and English. Crashaw's path led him to France in 1644, where he formally converted to Roman Catholicism. His dire financial circumstances in Paris drew the attention of his friend and fellow poet Abraham Cowley when Queen Henrietta Maria of England relocated to the city with her retinue in 1646. Queen Henrietta Maria recommended Crashaw to the Pope, but it was not until shortly before his death that he received the position of canon at the Cathedral of Santa Casa Loreto. His English religious poems were republished in Paris in 1652 under the title Carmen Dio Nostro. Notably, some of his most delicate lines are found in his writings appended to The Flaming Heart, a poem dedicated to Saint Teresa of Avila. John Denham. Sir John Denham is renowned as the poet who introduced the leisurely meditative poem as a distinctive English genre, particularly through his portrayal of a specific landscape. Denham's poetic career began with the tragic work The Sophie, but he is most celebrated for his poem Cooper's Hill. This poem holds a special place in English literature as the earliest example dedicated to local description, offering a vivid portrayal of the Thames Valley landscape around his residence in Egham, Surrey. Denham revisited and revised this poem numerous times, with each version reflecting the political and cultural transformations brought about by the Civil War. While Denham and his contemporary Edmund Waller are not considered great poets, their contributions to modern versification and poetic style remain significant. Their influence on the evolution of English poetry is acknowledged, earning them a respected place among British poets. Notably, Samuel Johnson praised Denham's verse for its exemplary use of multiple words. However, Denham's standing in literary history today may be more modest than the extravagant praise he received in the past. Thomas Treherne. Thomas Treherne was a multifaceted English poet, Anglican cleric, theologian, and religious writer. His profound and scholarly spirituality has led some parts of the Anglican Communion to commemorate him on the anniversary of his burial, either on 10 October or 27 September. Treherne's most renowned work today is Centuries of Meditations, a collection of concise paragraphs that delve into reflections on various aspects of Christian life, ministry, philosophy, happiness, desire, and childhood. This work gained widespread recognition when first published in 1908 after its rediscovery in a manuscript a decade earlier. His poetry, which carries similar themes, was initially published in 1903 and 1910. Beyond poetry, Treherne's prose includes writings such as Roman Forgeries, Christian ethics, and a serious and pathetical contemplation of the mercies of God. Treherne's writings frequently explore the splendor of creation and his profound, intimate connection with God. His works radiate an impassioned and almost childlike love for the divine. His style is often compared to later poets such as William Blake, Walt Whitman, and Gerard Manley Hopkins, who also explored similar themes in their poetry. Treherne's deep appreciation for the natural world, portrayed in a way that anticipates Romanticism by 2 centuries, further distinguishes his literary contributions.